People are gonna hear me. So Stepan is just saying hello and announcing that he has no sound. Okay. Uh, Hi everyone. This is iBookBinding podcast. And we are live. Yes, we are live. Uh, can we hear Stepan? No,
Now it should work.
not yet.
Yeah. Okay. Okay.
Can
Your
you hear
part.
me as well?
Yeah. It was only on my side. Yeah. It's just because things happen. Things happen. Technical stuff. Anyway. Yeah. Pavel is absolutely right. It's iBook Binding's live stream. Another one. We're hoping to return to almost to an almost weekly schedule as it was before. And today we have not a bookbinder or any sort of craftsperson like we usually have. We have Dr. Nick Posegay, and we'll talk about Cairo Genizah stuff, manuscripts, ancient books, and a new book that will be up for sale soon in a couple of months, in a month, a bit later. That's dedicated.
Yeah, it should be available at the end of September.
End of
Although
September.
you can pre-order it now.
Yeah, perfect.
Yeah.
And
Shipped
that
in.
is dedicated to Cairo Genizah and objects of from this collection. So, hi Nick, nice to have you here.
Thank you. Thanks for having me back.
Pasha, did you check that we have streams on both platforms? Everything's fine. Did you see how it works?
Yes, yes, we do. Yes,
Okay.
we do.
Okay, perfect. That's great. So yeah, as usual, my co-host is Pavel Voronin, and I'm Stepan Chizhov. Nice to have all of you here who are watching us. Please, if you have any questions, post comments, and we'll pass them to Nick, and we'll see how it goes. If you would like to share with us from where you are joining us, it's always a pleasure to see the geography of our audience. So please tell us which country, which city, town, or other sort of locality you are joining from. And please check the links in the description of this video. There are links to Cairo Genizah project on research project on Instagram, and also links to pre-order this book we'll be discussing today. There are two different links for the UK, separately for the UK and for the other world, rest of the world. So that's that, and well, let's start. Pasha, please. I'm sure you have many more questions than I have.
So, Nick, sorry if I sound a bit provocative, but from the look of it, it's basically a coffee table book full of images of paper scraps.
Yes.
So what is Cairo Genizah? Why do you think it would be interesting for people to look at those images of some very fragmented pages, and what's your role in compiling that book?
Right. Well, I suppose there are currently 2 physical copies of the book in the world. I have one, and my co-author has one. We got these from the printer as advanced copies. So that's what it looks like. And I suppose to answer your question, why do we want to look at fragment scraps of paper, that is related to what the Cairo Genizah even is. And Genizah is a Hebrew word, and it refers to a hidden storeroom or cupboard, usually in a synagogue, that Jewish communities use to deposit old books or manuscripts with the name of God on it, the sacred name of God in Hebrew, to prevent those items from being profaned and desecrated like regular rubbish. Instead, it protects them and keeps them sacred until they can be given a proper burial at a later date. The thing about the Cairo Genizah is it refers to a specific set of these Genizah, Genizot, which is the plural, and centered around the Ben Ezra synagogue in Old Cairo, which the Jewish community of Cairo used to store manuscripts from about the 11th century up until the end of the 19th century. So in total, it's almost 300, maybe 400,000 scraps of old books and manuscripts that have since been moved to mainly European and American libraries. About 2/3 of them are at the University of Cambridge, at the University Library, where I've been working for the last several years. And these fragments show us an unprecedented cross-section of the book culture of not just Jews in Cairo, but all people of Cairo. For over 1,000 years, from the Middle Ages up to the beginning of the printing press, and even into things like lithography and other printing types. It lets us see like exactly what kind of books and book technologies the people of Egypt had access to at any given time. Where were they getting their books from? Printed books, of course, have the place of publication on them. So if it says Venice and then it's in Egypt, that tells us a lot about where Egyptians were getting books from. So when I see a fragment, I can show you a fragment from any book from here. So for example, we just have one page of this book, which is a Hebrew prayer text that was printed in Venice in the 17th century. And then it ended up in Cairo, and we just have this one page of it. And that one page tells us that Egyptian Jews were in contact with Venice. They could get books shipped from Venetian printers. Exactly who was sending them overseas, we don't know for sure, but they had access to that. And presumably there was once a whole book there. So every single scrap like that tells us that there was a book here once. And that, I think, is why even individual scraps are so important. So my role, though, in making this book, I'm the co-author. I've spent the last year with my colleague, Melanie Schmier-Lee, and we've curated over 300 manuscript scraps and printed book scraps from the Cairo Genizah to put into this, like you said, coffee table book that is meant to be both an education piece for general audiences who may not be experts in Hebrew or Arabic, and also sort of an art piece, because a lot of them, as you know, every book is unique. Even copies of the same book are unique, and they can be worth looking at.
So there's one thing you mentioned, that Genizah is usually a room in a synagogue, but not always. As many of our viewers know, I've been living in the Balkans for the last 2 years, and I saw two Genizot in Belgrade and in Sarajevo, and none of them are rooms, let alone parts of synagogues. They are both graves. And it was very unusual for me. Like, you go to the central cemetery in Belgrade and you see this very ornate tombstone, and it says that this is where every 10 years or so we bury our sacred books. And the same thing used to happen up until 1970s, I think, in Sarajevo. And just 10 years ago, a documentarian from US found out that some of the treasures of her own family used to be buried there, came back, found a rabbi who agreed to open the Genizah again and bury some new materials inside. So it was really exciting to me to find out that this tradition is still very much alive in this unusual form. So the question I wanted to ask you, perhaps the most interesting part of the book for me, was the part of the story of Genizah that is very rarely told, almost not at all, that it was used up until the very moment when it was discovered,
Yeah.
by the Western scholars. So very late 19th century material was, from what I understand, recently cataloged, and up to 1880s there were things deposited in the Genizah. Could you tell us about that material, what it was like working on it.
Yes, so you're right. I actually in the last few years have done quite a bit of research on the latest material in the Geniza because for years we've known what the earliest things are, things from the 6th, 7th, 8th century CE. But I realized we didn't even know what the latest item in the collection was. So I went out and I did a big survey of manuscripts to try and find that. And you're right, there are books from the 1880s, even there are newspaper fragments from the 1890s that were printed in Cairo, probably some that were printed even after Western scholars arrived and started taking things away. Because, like you said, the practice of Geniza has not stopped. Jewish communities all over the world continue to practice it. And they were using it even after Cambridge scholars took most of the fragments that were in Cairo back to England. Even after that, there's what's called the New Cairo Genizah, which is material that was deposited by the Jewish community there even into the 20th century, up until the 20s and 30s. And a lot of that was buried at what's called the Basatin Cemetery, which is a cemetery on the edge of Old Cairo, where we know that many of the manuscripts that ended up in what's now the Cairo Genizah collections, some of them originated there, as well as in the synagogue space. So the 19th century is actually really interesting in the Genizah story because it seems that after about the 1860s, as Western scholars were going to Cairo more and more often to purchase antiquities, some of them were looking for manuscripts, and the local communities, including the Jewish community there, realized that Western university scholars were willing to pay money for these things. They started to deposit just about all of their printed books into the Cairo Genizah in the Ben Ezra synagogue again, even though that synagogue had mostly fallen out of use and most Jews in the community had moved to other parts of Cairo. So from the 1850s and 1860s, we find tons of small, like octavo size, printed prayer books and Bibles and other things that we expect just common people would have been using in their day-to-day lives, like pocket-sized books. And they are from places we don't expect. They're from Vienna, they're from Trieste, some are from, there's one at least from Warsaw, there's a few scraps of things that I'm pretty sure were printed in Russia that I haven't really proved yet. But they're from all over the Mediterranean. There's also a ton from Salonika and Constantinople. And these all end up in Egypt, which really shows the evidence of like a very active book trade and literary culture for the Jews of Cairo at the end of the 20th century. And they realize that they have these books, and there are people from the West who, for some reason, are willing to pay money for them. So they start putting them all into Cairo Genizah. And for a long time, medievalists, many of my colleagues just didn't care about this stuff because they study medieval history. But we've learned in recent years that the Genizah actually preserves an incredible record of printing and what types of printed material made it to Egypt between 1450 and 1900. So that's something I've really been working on recently.
You already mentioned your co-author, and I wanted to ask you about how this work was done between the two of you. What's the balance? What were responsibilities of each of you? How does it work for a book like that?
Between me and Melanie.
Yeah.
Yeah. Right. So the book actually, it comes from two projects that we had managed separately for a while. And then in 2023, we came together and pooled our resources, so to speak. So as you know, and this is how I know you, I had been running a Genizah Instagram page for the Genizah Research Unit where I worked for a couple of years, where we try and post little snippets, little stories about different fragments in the collection that I find particularly interesting or instructive. Aimed at more of a general audience because we spend enough time writing for academics that it's also important to do public education and outreach. So I was doing that for a while, and we built up a pretty good backlog of little posts that could be put into a coffee table type book format. At the same time, Mel had been running the public education side of Genizah tours at the university library. So you can book a tour if you're in Cambridge and get a tour of the collection led most of the time by Mel, although other people, I've done a few of those tours as well. And she is outstanding at that. She'll bring out, 20 or 30 manuscript fragments and tell the story of the Genizah and show them to people and answer questions. So she had learned a lot about what people were really interested in and what questions they had. And then the two of us together, we each had lists of our favorite fragments, the most interesting ones, that we had curated over time, and we combined that. There were a lot of debates over, limited book space and which pictures we should put in. But in the end, I think we got a really good spread of about 300 manuscripts that really represent like the highlights of the Cairo Genizah in Cambridge.
Speaking of your Instagram page, a few weeks ago, I think, I saw a post with a term that I never heard before, crate expedition. Like, so basically, not all of the fragments are published, not all of them are digitized. Some of them are still in the crates.
Sort of. So this is the thing, the Cairo Genizah, when we say Cairo Genizah now, it refers to all of these manuscripts that came out of Egypt and are now in Western institutions. But like I said, there are over 200, well, there's about 200,000 fragments that are currently in Cambridge University Library. And when the first scholar from Cambridge who was looking at these brought them to England, that was Solomon Schechter in 1897. He spent about 5 years at the library cataloging them and unpacking them from the crates that he used to ship them from Egypt. He just sent them in the mail because it was all the British Empire at the time, so he could just kind of do that. So he's unpacking these crates and he sorts about 40,000 fragments that he thinks are the most important. But then he decides that it's really exhausting, and to be fair, it was. It was exhausting, and he was working from scratch. There's no catalogs, there's no digitization, there's no conservation. And he takes a new job at the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York, and he leaves Cambridge. So that leaves 150,000 fragments still in the boxes. And there's a little bit of research done over the next 5 or 10 years, but after that, all of the boxes just get moved to the attic in the university library. So, you can do the math. It's 3/4 of the collection. And it wasn't until the 1950s that a guy called Shlomo Goitein, who came to Cambridge specifically looking for manuscripts related to economic history. And while he was there, one of the librarians said, "Hey, we've got all these boxes of Hebrew stuff up in the attic. Do you want to take a look?" So they took him up to the 7th floor, and he said, "Wow, these are incredibly valuable." And he starts pulling out like autographs by Moses Maimonides and other famous Jewish scholars from the Middle Ages that had just been sitting up there collecting dust. They were already collecting dust in the first Genizah, and then they sort of went into another Genizah in Cambridge. So Goitein sets up a research group, and all of his students spend the next decade just trying to unpack these boxes, and they do another 50,000. And that leads eventually in the 1970s to the founding of the Genizah Research Unit under Stefan Reif. And Stefan led the unit for over 30 years. And he's the one who in the 1980s finally finished unpacking, sorting, conserving, and actually putting numbers on every single fragment in the Cambridge collection. So they're all properly conserved now, but it wasn't until 1986-ish that happened. So it was originally estimated to be a 10-year project, and then that was 90 years later. And to be honest, we're still cataloging now. There's lots of fragments that we have images of, but they're not online yet because we haven't even read them. We're working to catalog and put data with them, but until you have that, the context is very difficult to reconstruct.
That's
But it's not like
anyone's moving nightmare. Unpacking that took a century. I wanted to read a couple of comments before we move forward. There are no questions there yet, but some of our viewers wrote from where they are joining us, and maybe they will have some questions a bit later. So we have Ryan Clater, Michigan, USA. Jim Kannenberg Jr., Illinois, USA. Betty Harwell from Nashville, and Dave Turnbull, one of our regulars from Scotland. So nice to have all of you here. If you have any questions about the collection, about the new book, please post them and we will pass them to Nick. But Pavel, please, you wanted to say something or ask something? I don't know.
Yeah, so you said it's all been imaged, but there's also this issue of palimpsests, of which there are quite a few, and in the highlights section there is this one fragment that drew my attention. It's 10th century Hebrew text over 8th century Bible in Georgian. And as far as I know, the earliest dated full copy of Bible in Georgian is late 9th century, almost into the 10th. So this is earlier by over a century. Do you think there are still some fragments that that's the one. So
Yep, that's the one.
Yes. So that you can clearly see that there are two scripts. But in some other examples, it's very possible that there are still palimpsests and earlier layers to be discovered. Are there plans for multi-spectral imaging and stuff to try and uncover earlier layers?
So the first, for anyone who doesn't know in the audience, a palimpsest is a manuscript that was written once, and then the text was erased somehow. Usually, since it's on parchment, you can scrape it or wash it off. And then another text was written over it because parchment was very expensive. So in the medieval period, it was frequently recycled to write a new text. And we call these texts that have been written multiple times palimpsests. And like Pavel mentioned, often the undertext, the original text, can be a century or even more older than the overtext. And that preserves ancient books that would have otherwise been lost, like this Georgian Bible. Although this is, Old Georgian Bible. We have done, I say we, it's the Cambridge University Library, digital services have done multispectral imaging on a lot of our palimpsest fragments, including some of the oldest Bible fragments in the world. There are 6th and 7th century Greek Bible fragments that are the oldest attested copies of those particular translations. And those have undergone multispectral imaging to more clearly extract the undertext and overtext, because you can highlight the text in different colors if you're scanning with spectrums or wavelengths of light beyond the visible spectrum, and they can detect traces of ink that the human eye cannot detect. So that's been done for some of the Greek palimpsests and some of the Christian, Palestinian, Aramaic palimpsests, which all of these are overwritten by Hebrew poetry later. And we think that most of them came from Christian monasteries in Palestine that then, once the books, they didn't want their books anymore, they sold or disposed of the parchment because it was, valuable to resell it. And then it was reused by Jewish scribes to write Hebrew poetry and things. As far as I know, all of the old Georgian fragments have at least been identified and published. They were actually published in the 1940s. And if I don't remember offhand who exactly the author was, but if you want those references, Pavel, I can get them for you afterwards. That's not to say, though, that there aren't still palimpsest fragments to be found. I know more recently that some Christian Palestinian Aramaic fragments have been found in the 21st century. A few years ago, I found a fragment that was originally Arabic, and the Arabic was washed off to write in Hebrew. But it hasn't
Sorry,
been.
how do you search for them? You just notice some traces, or do you use like a ultraviolet light? What's
It's a combination of things. The difficulty, of course, is that there's so much material, 200,000 fragments that we're cataloging. So I often, one of my jobs at the Genizah Research Unit was to catalog, and basically my boss would give me a big folder of fragments and say, what are these? Tell us what they are, describe them. And once in a while, you find something that's really unexpected that just happened to be in there. So in a way, you'll be looking for all the signs of a palimpsest, which is usually, some fragment of text that's going in a different direction, faded text compared to a darker text on top, signs of water damage that can also help bring out different layers of ink and things. But they're very rare because they're by definition, they've been reused multiple times. You don't have the entire thing. They've been damaged, and then they were reused, and then they were damaged again, which got them into the Genizah. So it's hard to identify, and it takes a lot. Like you have to make a case when you're working in these big library institutions for why a particular object needs like multispectral imaging or carbon-14 dating or any of these more expensive scientific methods, because we have limited resources and big collections. So it costs money to do these, unfortunately. So we can't image everything that we want to image. We can't carbon-14 date everything that we want to date, things like that.
But there is a very successful example from Father Justin's work in Sinai. He initiated spectral imaging for all of his earliest material. He's the head librarian there, and they found all sorts of things. Some earliest Georgian texts, a lost text from Caucasian Albania, the very first book of its kind, etc., etc. So I wish you all the luck in convincing your superiors that more and more needs to be scanned that way.
I'm with you. More and more analysis is always good.
You mentioned that some of these vellum materials, used vellum materials, were sold and resold, and that's something that I never even thought about, because I'm interested in palimpsest as a layman, as a layperson who is absolutely outside of this. But then for me, always the image was of some I don't know, monk or whatever, who had some old damaged or unused book, and then he ordered his scribes to renew the material and use it again. But well, it's a writing material. Why not to sell it? And that's an interesting. Was there a market for that? Do you have any information about that? How did it work?
Definitely. There was definitely a market for it. So in the medieval period, in Egypt at least, we know that the whole culture was highly centered around recycling. So any scrap of paper or parchment for that matter, that had leftover space on it after it was used for one thing, it was often recycled for another thing. So we'll get fragments in the Genizah with multiple texts written on them, multiple unrelated texts by different authors. So for example, we have petitions that were sent to the Islamic government of Saladin Salah ad-Din, the Sultan who fought against the Crusaders. And people petitioned his government with these big Arabic documents, and you write them in really big Arabic script because you don't want the Sultan to have to squint when he's reading your requests. But they're in huge script with space between the lines. And then the Ayyubid chancery, which was his government, didn't keep permanent records, so they would dispose of these huge petitions. We think they were probably sold as waste paper, and a lot of them ended up in the Jewish community of Cairo, who used them, and they wrote like Hebrew essays in between the lines of the giant Arabic. And then because they wrote Hebrew on them and they had the name of God, they had to go into the Genizah. So we have those now. And we know that there were you could call them stationers, basically people who sold paper and bookbinding materials and worked in the bookbinding trade along with more formal bookbinders in Cairo during the medieval period and up through the Ottoman period. We have these attested in historical sources saying, yeah, the bookbinders are here next to the gold sellers, next to the ink, the dyers, and so much of bookbinding ends up being recycling because not just palimpsests, but you can cut off margins of a larger book and sell those. Lots of parchment vellum manuscripts are reused to bind the covers of books. So
That was my
to go
next
around.
question. Yeah, because
Yes, yes.
as a bookbinder, I'm also always interested in objects like this. And when I see some of my fellow bookbinders who work with these books, or fellow booksellers who offer something new like that in their catalogs, I'm always quite excited. So, do you have anything like that there in your
Yes.
collection?
Well, this is why I thought of you when we were making this book, and I reached out to you, Stepan, because we have a whole chapter that is about bookbinding and scribal arts, basically the production of how do you make manuscripts, how do you make books in a pre-modern world.
That was my hook to all of the bookbinders who will watch this video in the future or are watching now. Just to look for this this book about the Cairo Genizah collection. So yeah.
Sorry, I'm flipping through the book to try and find the chapter.
Page 285 is for the binding fragment.
Yeah. So we do have a couple scraps of binding leather. So this is more what you expect of,
Yeah.
You would expect a piece of leather to be used and put onto the boards of a book. And that one actually has what's called a flap binding. So in the Islamic world, a lot of bindings have an extra flap that closes over the boards. We don't actually have many of these types of leather scraps in the Genizah collections. If you ask me, and this is just speculation, it's because they would have been useful elsewhere. And when something's already falling apart and you're going to put in the Genizah, the covers have probably already come off. But one thing that is preserved in the Genizah frequently is evidence of fragments that have been repurposed to, and we can see where they've been sewn on to covers or spines of things. So, for example, hopefully you'll be able to see this, or maybe Pavel can pull it up on your screen. So, for instance, here, this is a paper manuscript, but you should be able to see 2 rows of holes at the bottom there.
Yeah.
So those holes are not from binding this book originally. You would expect vertical rows of holes, of course, where the quires were sewn together, but these are horizontal, and there's even a fold down here. So you can see this fold in between the 2 rows. That fold would have corresponded to the spine of the book. And then the 2 rows of holes are sewing stations. So this is where this particular fragment, which is actually a piece of the Quran, was sewn onto the boards of another book. And that was, to protect it like any other bookbinding material. But the text of the Quran would have been on the inside of this, and you wouldn't have been able to read it. So if it was put around, for example, a Hebrew book or another book used by a Jew or a Christian in Cairo, and it had Hebrew written inside that book, and then that book fell apart, they would put the whole thing into the Genizah, and that's how we end up with certain things like parts of the Quran. But there's lots of little clues like that where you can tell that a manuscript has been recycled for bookbinding. So you can see the sewing stations. That's one of the most obvious ones, but you can also see like some fragments are just folded in a particular way that would not happen by chance. You have symmetrical folds and they're straight, and then you could imagine where a book would fit in it. And you think, okay, so this was used to bind something at one point. And also we get little fragments of things. I think this is also quite common in Europe, European bookbinding, where you have binding waste that are just tiny scraps of other manuscripts that get stuck into the spine to reinforce a book. There's lots of that as well. So that's what the bookbinding chapter is about. We tried to highlight some of those examples.
Great.
And
Perfect.
has any systematic work been done on those fragments? Can we like trace the development of technology or one style changing to another? Like, you know, the Shimai sort of things, number of sewing stations, the distance between them.
That is being done for Islamicate bookbinding. So basically, binding of the Islamic world is called Islamicate, because it relates not just to Muslim bookbinders, but anyone living in Islamic lands. That is being done not so much with Genizah material specifically because everything is so fragmentary. It's hard to get even accurate measurements of individual pieces of paper because they're missing dimensions. But that work is being done on other more complete collections, complete books that are extant from the Mamluk and Ottoman periods. Especially on like the exterior bindings, the flat bindings, they're very popular.
Pavel asked you about digitization and multispectral analysis and stuff like that. What about AI? Do you have any, thoughts on whether it can help the at least cataloging or some, menial and technical processes like that? Maybe not now, maybe in a couple of years because technologies are developing like with an insane speed.
Identifying scribal hands, for example.
Yeah.
So AI is in like the popular sense of generating text is not that useful to us, but machine learning and being able to examine images and detect scribal hands is something that is definitely happening already. So there are part of the Friedberg Genizah project, which was a project to digitize every fragment from the Cairo Genizah in the entire world. The Friedberg Genizah project, you can just Google that and it'll come up. So that has images of every single manuscript in the Cairo Genizah, more or less on it. Even ones with no cataloging data, which is really useful for people who are doing this sort of machine learning analysis because they have multiple algorithms that have been trained on this huge amount of data, hundreds of thousands of fragments, and is getting pretty good at matching up manuscripts that are separate, written by the same scribe, and also identifying fragments of individual pages that actually belong together. Because frequently, when a book has fallen apart, you may find one page of it, and there's actually 5 more in other collections, but you would never know. But this technology, machine learning, you can't just brute force it with a human, but with the computer, you can look at so many more fragments, and then they're often checked by people. So in the Friedberg site, it'll bring up 100 images and say, all right, these are the ones that we think are the same scribe as the one that you input. And then it says, is it yes, no, or maybe? And then the human goes in and checks, and that improves the algorithm every time. So it can be very useful for identifying joins between things that otherwise we would never find.
This is
And
sort
what
of.
about
This is sorry, Pasha. I will finish my thought and I will pass the torch to you. This is sort of one of my dreams to live in a world in a few years or in a few decades when everything in all collections all over the world is digitized and scholars will have access to cross-reference materials from different collections. There should be so many things, working together in this way. So I really hope we'll get there if it survives.
Yeah. Yeah.
And what about deciphering the text, like identifying the text? So you have an image. Surely, for a good scribal hand, it should be possible for a machine learning algorithm to transcribe it and then try
Yeah.
and search in other collections. Like it took what, like 10, 20 years to identify the Damascus document known from Quran,
Qumran.
Qumran documents, that it was already known from your collection. It should be like that nowadays, but it's not.
Yeah, so this is it's tricky. The technology in theory can be used to identify texts. But as you see with all of these images, most of them are so damaged that it's difficult to get even an accurate OCR transcription, which would be the first step, to doing that. I know there are projects ongoing that are trying to develop tools to do this. Actually, in Syriac manuscript studies is very advanced in this area of the field, where there's a lot of projects going on with there's a tool called Transcribus, which is getting pretty good at this, and a lot of scholars working in Syriac studies who are developing algorithms to OCR Syriac manuscript text. But like you said, it has to be like a good, clean scribal hand. It can't be too damaged. And then even then, you need a human to go in and check the whole thing and see if they've gotten it right. So it's an iterative process, improving the algorithms over time. Eventually, we will get there for certainly printed texts, and then for good scribal hands with not a lot of damage. That's either here or it's going to be here in the next few years. I suspect anyway. But for these really damaged Genizah fragments, we're still a long way off because every single one is unique, and often if you only have one page, you don't have enough data. So it's going to be a work in progress. I'm hopeful that sort of technology is going to become more and more useful to historians and archivists like me. But for now, so much of it still relies on just, unfortunately, blind chance when you're cataloging something and you just think, I've seen this hand before, and then you have to go back and find the reference, and then we do a lot of that as well.
And is there a bias towards Latin, Greek versus Hebrew, let alone Arabic?
Certainly there are those sorts of biases. Even, I mean, in history in general, as a whole field, Western history has been foregrounded more than other regions forever. So there's certainly a lot more tools available for Latin and Greek, and a lot more Latin and Greek texts have been published, of course, than, for example, Arabic or Hebrew texts from the medieval period. Within Genizah studies itself, there is a bias towards Hebrew script, but that's because most of the fragments are in Hebrew script. So they're either Arabic in Hebrew script, which is called Judeo-Arabic, or they're Aramaic or they're Hebrew, and that's the majority of Genizah fragments. The ones in Arabic script is probably around 10,000 fragments total out of the entire 200,000 to 300,000. So most people who get into Genizah work are Hebrew specialists because that's the material, so there's also a lot more data for the algorithms to work with in recognizing scribal hands. So on the Friedberg project, it's much better at detecting Hebrew scribes than Arabic scribes.
We have a question on YouTube from Betty Harwell. The scraps look like ink blots. Any significance to how they are torn?
They are what?
I'm not sure what's any significance.
You mean this one that I was showing before?
I guess they were torn just during the use. Yeah. Well.
Oh, but actually there is a really great image in there where there is a rusted where there is rust damage. Could you show that? That's a really fun one. Yeah.
So this is another one from our bookbinding chapter and scribal arts chapter. So this is a Hebrew Bible that was written in iron gall ink. And iron gall ink contains iron.
Yeah.
And over time, it can rust.
Yeah.
And it eats right through the page. So the acid from the gall nuts and then the iron from the ink, and they oxidize and they eat straight through the page. So anything that was not written on survives, and then the text just destroys the material. This can happen if something isn't kept in proper conservation conditions, of course. So if this were happening to a manuscript in the university library today, conservation would intervene and stop it. But for something that was just sitting in a Genizah for 1,000 years or buried in the ground, undergoing water damage and changes in temperature, there are some texts we can actually, it's so precise that only the letters are eaten through. And the rest of the text around, the rest of the manuscript is still intact. So you can actually figure out what the text was because the holes are the exact shape that they were before. But that's just a consequence of the materials that were selected and the conditions that they ended up in.
Do you have any favorites, any favorite objects, or any favorite parts of this new book? What are your personal highlights?
Well, I mentioned earlier that I've been trying to study the printed material in the Cairo Genizah, which has been really understudied for the last 100 years, because most people are medievalists and they lose interest once you introduce the printing press. I think your audience may disagree on that point. So I fought pretty hard to get a whole chapter devoted to printing in this book. And I've selected about 30 of what I consider the most instructive pieces of printing that I've found in the Genizah to give a history of what printed books were present in Egypt between 1480 and 1900. So this is one of my favorites. If you look very closely, I will tell you a bit about this in a minute, but if you see on the side here, there's ink print from the printer's hand, or someone's hand. So this book is a copy of the Pentateuch, so the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible. It's not, it's a commentary on the Pentateuch, but it was printed by Eliezer Toledano, in Lisbon, so in Portugal, in 1489. So he was a Jewish printer working in Lisbon prior to the Iberian exile, before the Christian authorities kicked out all the Jewish printers. It's one of, it's an incunable. It's one of the earliest printed books in Hebrew. And that handprint, I like to think it's Eliezer Toledano himself. And of course, it could be one of his assistants, or it could be, some reader later who got ink on their hands. But it's incredible to be able to see someone's fingerprints, not just like the results of their work, but their actual fingerprints, to know that someone was here doing work on this and they made a mistake and they got their hand covered in ink and they grabbed the page. But the book was published anyway, because we have several pages from this choir. So it went out to someone and it ended up in Cairo.
And when do you think it ended up in Cairo? Can we say, at least for some of the material, when it was deposited in the Genizah?
Some, yes. For the printed material, it's tricky because, of course, we have the date of publication. This one was 1489. So either it was sold and sent to Cairo by, booksellers trading across the Mediterranean in the 1490s, which is possible. What I think is more likely, though, is that it was sold locally to the Jewish community in Portugal. Somebody owned it, read it, and then in 1497, when Christian authorities in Portugal said Jews and Muslims have to leave, kicked them out, and they all became refugees across the Mediterranean, they would have carried with them their valuables. And for a book of this scale, it's huge. It's like folio size and very well produced. And at a time when printing is a new technology, this would have been very valuable, this book. So Jewish refugee probably took it with them, and many of them left Europe for the Ottoman Empire, because the Ottoman Empire, for the most part, was safer for Jews in this period. So they went to, at the time, this would have been Mamluk Egypt until 1517. It becomes Ottoman Egypt. But if they brought the book with them because it was a store of value, and then they kept reading it and kept, that I think that is what happened for a lot of the books that were printed in Iberia. In later periods in the Genizah, the 15th and 16th centuries, there's a lot more books from Venice than from the Iberian Peninsula, because that's where the Hebrew printers are in Europe at the time, although most of them are Christian printers printing in Hebrew, because the Pope repeatedly banned Jews from printing in Italy. So those books definitely are being shipped from Italy to Cairo, I assume because there was some market for Hebrew books there.
it's amazing how we see traces of these events from so far away in Cairo, like like Spain and Portugal. They expelled Jews, and we see in a few years a spike in the deposition of material produced there. That's amazing.
Yes, it is. There's actually in the 15th and 16th century, we do see a spike, not just of printed books, but of Ladino manuscripts. So Ladino is Spanish written in Hebrew script. And we know that it's because Spanish refugees, Jewish refugees from Spain, ended up in Cairo. And then they just kept using the language that they had been speaking at home and writing in at home in their new home. And then that becomes a really solid Ladino-speaking community in Egypt for centuries afterwards.
And do you think there's a parallel to what you mentioned earlier of Viennese material in late 19th century? Is it the early Zionist movement moving in?
I don't know. I really don't know. All I can say is that one of the leading printers in Vienna, well, one of the leading Hebrew printers in the world at the time was a guy called Joseph Schlesinger, and he worked in Vienna, and he printed tons of these like little pocket books of the Bible, and there'd be one book of the Bible, so you have a little just pocket-sized Genesis or a little pocket-sized Exodus, and he is attested more than any other publisher from the 19th century in the Geniza. And we know that his little prayer books and Bibles were sold all over the Mediterranean world. So he was doing very well, able to ship through some kind of network, whether it was him directly or working with merchants, to get books as far away as Jewish markets in Cairo. And obviously there was demand for it because we've got, I found 8 or 10 of these books already, and I know that there are more from Joseph Schlesinger.
You talked a little bit about how the Jewish community of Cairo was sort of interested in um, having some profits from these old books when they were discovered. I just wanted to sort of to return to this thing and to reiterate how the process was organized, because all the time I see on the internet people discuss that I don't know, somebody found some part of Jewish Bible or something like that and framed it and put it on the wall, and then people come over and oh, it's a sacrilege, this book should be, I don't know, put to Genizah, or it should be held as a sacred object or whatever. So just to avoid any any angry people coming here and flooding our comments with stuff like that, were there any other examples of collections like that being sold to scholars, or how did it work in the
Yeah.
19th century? How does it work now? Are there any other examples like that?
Yeah, no, what I described, the process of Hebrew books and fragments from the Cairo Genizah being sold to Western scholars was not at all unique just to that situation, not just to Cairo, not just to the Jewish community, not just to the Genizah. But we know there are collections in the university library even from Western scholars who purchased loads of Greek and Arabic papyri from Cairo in the 19th and 20th centuries. There's a guy named George Michaelides from the 20th century, and we have a huge collection of his papyrus. And he, as far as we know, he just bought them in Cairo. So in the 19th century and the early 20th century, it was quote unquote legal to go into a country and purchase antiquities, artifacts of cultural heritage. And legal basically by the terms of the British Empire or whatever ruling colonial power there was. So it was legal technically for Solomon Schechter, for example, to go into Cairo and get a bunch of manuscripts from people and then to ship them to England. That would not be legal now. Basically, after the middle of the 20th century, you can't just go and buy artifacts and take someone's cultural heritage and take it to another country. So that is very closely controlled by governments and UN conventions and things. The fact that manuscripts were being sold on such a large scale to Western scholars is really it creates what I've described before as a perverse incentive. Basically, if you offer money to people for their manuscripts that they've put in a Genizah, for example, if you go to Cairo and you say, I'm looking for Genizah manuscripts, I'm willing to pay. People are going to start putting things in Genizahs or saying that they're from Genizahs to try and get money off of you. And that's not a dishonest thing, really. You've created a financial incentive. You've come into a place where you don't really belong and said, I don't understand what's going on here, but I'll buy. And that is one of the consequences of the colonial imposition that allows people like foreign scholars to go and try and extract cultural artifacts. So certainly there were lots of Western scholars from Cambridge, from Oxford, from America, from all over, who went to Cairo and purchased ancient Egyptian cultural artifacts and medieval cultural artifacts. But I wouldn't say I wouldn't say that the people who were selling those artifacts were desecrating them or disrespecting them. They were in a situation where that was something that was a logical thing for them to do.
Thank you.
And what do you think about the recent acquisition of Afghan Genizah material by the National Library of Israel? I don't know if you heard, the biggest Genizah, medieval Genizah since Cairo Genizah is the one found in Afghanistan.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. So who has the moral right to own it? Like, is it Afghani heritage? Is it Jewish heritage? And if it is Jewish, is Israel entitled to buy it? I find this whole story a bit murky, frankly.
It's certainly a bit murky, and there are, of course, what can be seen as conflicting identities. What is clear to me, at least from the historical periods and doing historical research, is that, for example, the Jews of Cairo oftentimes saw themselves as Egyptian just as much as they saw themselves as Jews. And I don't know as much about the Afghan Genizah. I don't work on that collection, but it is a collection of manuscripts that are now thought to be less of a Genizah and more like a family archive of sorts that were kept by a Jewish community in Afghanistan. Whether or not, there's no doubt that the material in the Cairo Genizah, for example, is Jewish heritage as well as Egyptian heritage, as well as Portuguese heritage or Spanish heritage or whatever. The people who came from wherever and immigrated to Cairo, it's the people who produced those manuscripts, it's their heritage. For the most part, from a legal standpoint, I'm on the side of if there's a manuscript or there's an artifact that's in a particular country and that's the context where it was created or deposited into a Genizah, it should stay there because it's the cultural heritage of the people or of that country. For example, in Egypt, there's still a Jewish community in Egypt. It's very small now, but for centuries, there was a large Jewish community in Egypt, and that was part of Egyptian culture just as much as Christian and Jewish was. So Jewish history is part of Egyptian history. So I guess that is my stance on it.
Thank you. You told us that you have something like an hour, so we'll probably have to let you go pretty soon.
I can go, a little bit longer, 15, 20 minutes.
Yeah, sure. I had a question and absolutely blanked, but Pasha is ready to ask something else. Yeah, I hope it returned to me.
Can we talk about magic? Because this is something that is well illustrated in the book and also something that is not probably immediately associated with a synagogue.
That's true. Yeah, you're right. We have a whole chapter about magic.
And there are even amulets illuminated with figures like page 120. I think this is something that when you see as deposited in a
Right.
synagogue,
So,
yes.
yeah, this was in a synagogue. Why? You can see it's all Arabic script, and it's got a very strange picture of maybe a person with a snake over his shoulders. Just a very bizarre looking dude. And the Arabic doesn't even really say anything. It's mostly like nonsense magic sounds, like alakazam, stuff like that. But you're right. This is an amulet, magical amulet that would have been used for some sort of protective feature. So there was a perception in medieval Egypt that magic was in a sense real. They believed that if you had an amulet produced in a specific way for a specific purpose, it could protect you against evil spirits. This one is probably something like that, protecting against demons or jinn or something like that. But there are other ones that have we have a whole page of amulets. These are
Mhm.
all scorpion amulets. So they've all got little pictures of scorpions on them. You can see there. Um, and we know that these were mass produced. And they would be tiny little scraps, like barely bigger than a postage stamp. And you would roll it up and put it in an amulet case, which is a little cylinder that you could wear as a necklace. And the idea was that it would protect you from scorpions, which, as we can see from how many of these there are, that was a big concern for people in Egypt, which makes sense. Um, so what I really like about these magical texts, whether or not they worked, the point is people believe they worked. And there are spells and amulets for making people listen to the words that you're saying, for scrying in a mirror to try and see things that aren't there, for turning invisible. There are ones for expelling demons. There are ones for making people fall in love. There are ones for making a husband and wife to stop fighting. And there's one to a spell to make a child take a bath. Everything that you could imagine.
And
Um,
eat his porridge,
yeah,
yes.
yeah, that's the thing. These texts, they're not, for the most part, produced by like really professional scribes or scholars or anything like that. They are targeted to common people, and it tells us what people were actually concerned about on a day-to-day basis. Not Bible commentaries and prayer books, the stuff you expect to see in a Geniza, but also scorpions and whether or not there's lots and lots of amulets for that are definitely targeted at women, many of them probably produced by women, whose names we don't know, but they were concerned about becoming pregnant or not becoming pregnant or stopping complications when you were pregnant. And there's lots of, let's see, we actually have Jewish and Islamic manuscripts, amulets for basically easing childbirth. So the stuff that we see in magic, yeah. So this is a Jewish amulet and then an Islamic amulet for easing childbirth. So what we see is that magic, the tradition of popular magic in Egypt transcends religious boundaries. We see the same motifs repeated, the same types of spells repeated in Muslim, Jewish, and Christian communities. And also it transcends time. Because a lot of the amulets are in this long vertical format. So they'll be skinny and then long. And it is emulating the ancient Egyptian papyrus scrolls that would have been skinny and long. And they have very similar motifs and magical symbols. So this is a tradition that is not limited to any one community and goes back thousands and thousands of years in Egypt. And we see it in the Geniza and even past.
And does it still survive? Do you know anything about that?
To some extent, yes, it does. But once you get past the end of the 19th century, then my expertise falls off.
Okay. Anyway, I wanted to invite our viewers, our current viewers, and our future viewers to check out the pre-order page. Again, there are links in the description of this video. Please check. What's the price for the book?
It is £45
Yeah.
if you order it from the Cambridge University Library. Currently, that will only ship to the UK, or it is $60 if you order it in the United States. And the shipping is pretty high for worldwide shipping, unfortunately, because the book is so heavy. We are working on this, trying to get it down. But in the US, it's $60. So if you're in the US, buy it from the Gorgias Press website. Then I assume that will be one of the links in the description.
Yeah. That's one of the links in the description. So please go check it out. Pre-order if your budget allows it. I would definitely want to order this book. We'll see. I'm not sure that my budget allows it at the moment.
I gotta be honest, we worked so hard to keep the cost down as low as possible because we knew it would be heavy and it would be hard to ship. But if you're in England for sure, it will be much lower shipping costs. And if you're in Cambridge, from September, we will be stocking the book also in the Cambridge University Library. So if you're ever around, you can buy it there.
That's also what I wanted to say. That I finally need to go to Cambridge because I've been to Oxford several times already with friends and relatives and stuff, but I haven't been to Cambridge yet, and I definitely need to go there and
If you guys go to Cambridge, let me know and I will hook you up with a tour of the Genizah.
Yeah, that's definitely one of the things I'd like to do, and hopefully we'll do it. I don't know, maybe later this year. We'll see. I'll be in contact with you. I'll send you a message. So yeah, I don't know, Pasha. Do you have any other questions you'd like?
Oh,
to
I
ask
have an
today?
infinite number of questions, but do you? You've been quiet.
Yeah. I don't know. I'm kind of preoccupied with different stuff today. Somehow, I had lots of technical issues, and so I've been more absent today than usual. Sorry about that.
That's okay.
But yeah, things happen. So yeah. Pasha, I don't know. I will leave questions to you if you have if you want to ask anything else. But
If you want to give me, let's say, one more question and we can talk about that.
Yeah,
perfect.
Let's do that. So, what do you think was the actual attitude towards depiction of human beings in Jewish Cairo? Because in the chapter with illustrations, illuminations, I don't remember what the chapter is, you can see a guy firing flowers from a cannon and whatnot, and do these illustrations appear later when Western European Jews come back, like the Spanish? Yes. But
This
what,
is genuinely,
what,
this might be my favorite fragment in the whole book. Just
yes.
'cause it's got so much character. This is an Ottoman era painting, although it's very rough. It's not like a formal painting of a guy on a cart with wheels and firing a cannon, but the cannon has flowers coming out of it. And just the guy, he looks like a little candlestick to me, and I just think it's delightful. This is definitely from the Ottoman period. When exactly is hard to say, maybe 17th or 18th century. But yeah, it's I don't know if using Genizah evidence, certainly the non-literary evidence, we can make any sweeping claims about attitudes towards depicting human figures in art, because there are also earlier ones from even before Jews from Western Europe came in large numbers. So for example, this one, which is, it used to be a whole ship, now it's half a ship, but it's just some sailors, and the inscription is in Judeo-Arabic, and you can see a Star of David even on the sail. And these are, it's a sketch, it's not a formal piece of artwork. So the degree to which like ideological controls on what could or could not be depicted would have played into that is really hard to say. But it's clear that someone drew it, and they thought it was okay to draw. This is one of the best chapters, honestly. but you get just these two guys in the margin just fighting a horseman and an archer. So yeah, really they show that these sketches and things that aren't like formal art pieces are some of the most intriguing in the Genizah, because you just know someone somewhere was reading this book or was doing this homework assignment and they got bored and they wrote they drew a picture of a guy firing a cannon. So yeah. That's all I can say. I wish I had a better answer than that.
Yeah, I enjoyed the marginalia as I always do a lot. It's just that you don't usually associate marginalia and especially human figures with Jewish material.
I will say that's true. The more formal Bibles that we know were made by professional scribes, there's no I can't even think of a single time where there's marginalia in the way that we find them in Western European books. So those ones, you know, the margins are all full of the Masorah, so the Masoretic notes in Hebrew and Aramaic, and not figures like this. I'm trying to think if there are any from the later periods that I've seen with marginalia, but I'm also drawing a blank there. I don't think there really are.
And I just wanted to share that I recently went again to Sarajevo, the third time this year somehow. And they have in their National Museum, Sarajevo Haggadah, this amazing book from the golden era of Spanish Jewry, illustrated in Western European style, but entirely Jewish material. And they turn a page every 3 months. So every time I go there, there's a new page to see, and I can't recommend enough that you go and see it too. It's an amazing survival with an amazing history. I think we should invite somebody from Sarajevo to talk about their libraries, because they are like Cairo. They are in a way small Cairo, small Istanbul. They have Jews and Arabs and Christians and wars and whatnot, and even a small Genizah that has not been open to this day. So who knows?
Right. Well, thank you so much. I've learned so much about Sarajevo from you in just a little bit. So thank you.
Well, thanks for being with us today, Nick. So this was Dr. Nick Posegay. Thanks for answering our questions, and please use the links in the description to learn more about the Cairo Genizah and about this book. Yes, this book is open for pre-order right now, and will be sold starting late in September. As Nick told us, you can, if you are in England, you can go to Cambridge and you will be able to buy it from Cambridge Library Bookshop. Was it right?
University Library
Bookshop, or order it online. So do that, please do that.
Yeah. Yes, please.
Yeah.
Thanks for having me on again. It's really great to talk to you.
Yeah, we'll stay here for maybe 30 more seconds while the stream ends on both platforms, and but that's it for today. Thanks everybody for watching, and see you next time.